Remember the resistance, the sprawling self-righteous movement led by a network of ostensibly liberal influencers and pundits who thrived during Trump's first presidency? From 2017 to 2020, anti-Trump resistance influencers dominated the online media ecosystem. They framed themselves as defenders of democracy and fed the public's relentless thirst for Trump updates. There was Seth Abramson, who posted intricate Twitter megathreads that promised to connect Trump to 1,000 secret plots. Ed and Brian Krasenstein flooded replies on Twitter with breathless Trump takedowns. And you even had celebrities like Alyssa Milano and Mark Hamill hop on the resistance bandwagon, fighting with MAGA trolls while defending the Democratic establishment. The resistance was a movement of memes, Mueller fan fiction, and copious donations to organizations like Act Blue. It was driven by the belief that a witty clapback or well-placed "Sir, I dissent" could topple Trump's regime. Last month, I was back in Washington, D.C. to cover the inauguration. Thousands of Trump supporters waited hours in sub-freezing temperatures to catch a glimpse of the president at a rally held at the Capitol Arena. I walked from the Capitol to the arena, up Pennsylvania, past the Waldorf Astoria, towards the White House. And on that entire journey, I did not witness a single protest. It was cold, but Trump supporters were cheering in the streets. They were drinking, eating, waltzing around, and buying an absurd amount of merch available at outdoor kiosks. 8 years ago, I was sitting in the 7th row for Trump's first inauguration. When I left the Capitol that day, the scene could not have been more different. Just hours after Trump was sworn in, widespread protests erupted across D.C. and other cities. Thousands of people took to the streets, burning and overturning cars. More than 200 demonstrators were arrested during confrontations that resulted in property damage and clashes with law enforcement. The next day, over 500,000 people swarmed the streets of D.C. for the Women's March, the largest single-day protest in U.S. history. Every single week for months, there were marches and protests with thousands of people. There was the Science March, the Tax March, the March for Truth, the March to call for Trump's impeachment, and dozens more. The protests underlied what ultimately became known as the resistance, a movement of Hillary-supporting liberals, disaffected conservatives who opposed Trump's agenda, and a smattering of progressive activists, all of whom banded together to oppose Trump's policies and actions. The movement gathered widespread support on social media platforms through hashtags like #resist and #theresistance, both of which trended multiple times on Instagram and Twitter throughout 2017. The resistance movement was fed by a steady stream of resistance media. Traditional news organizations like CNN and the Washington Post attempted to ride the resistance wave. In February 2017, just 1 month after Trump took office, the Washington Post changed its slogan to "Democracy Dies in Darkness." An entire ecosystem of alternative media and anti-Trump influencers quickly arose to feed the hunger for 24/7 anti-Trump news. The online resistance boomed, birthing a slew of new podcasts, newsletters, and Twitter personalities who stoked liberals' fears with nonstop updates on things like Russiagate, Trump's impending impeachment. In their minds, Robert Mueller was always just one step away from putting Trump behind bars for life. Back then, Democratic politicians were outspoken about the dangers they claimed Trump posed. Rep. Maxine Waters called Trump's advisors scumbags and said that the White House was now the white supremacist's house. Rep. Al Green called for Trump's impeachment on the House floor, and the resistance helped spur social movements that arose throughout Trump's first presidency. There was the effort to abolish ICE and reform immigration, Me Too, which sought to draw attention to misogynistic hate, and the Black Lives Matter movement, which peaked in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. Support for Bernie Sanders surged during the Democratic primaries, and many young people felt hopeful by the end of Trump's first presidency that we might all be moving towards a more progressive future. When the COVID pandemic hit, liberals fought for public health measures and clanged pots and pans outside their windows to support healthcare workers and protect the vulnerable. Just 4 years later, the resistance is dead. Not only did liberals face a definitive electoral loss to Trump in 2024, there is no widespread coalition fighting Trump's actions and policies. Trumpism has completely subsumed the Republican establishment, and right-wing reactionary ideology is culturally dominant. Democrats do not seem as anguished or animated by Trump's restoration as they were by his ascension, the journalist Ross Barkan recently wrote in the New York Times. The left is looking up after 8 years of resisting Trump and finding that he has expanded his vote share in each general election. And some progressives are even hoping to work with Trump if he embraces their policy aims, while centrists fret that the Republicans have outflanked them on cultural issues. Border policies that were decried as fascist under Trump's first term have been embraced by mainstream Democrats. The old discourse around the normalization of Trump is dead, and businesses that once distanced themselves from Trump now giddily treat him as any other president. But how did we get here? How was this broad-based anti-Trump coalition dismantled? And where did all those resistance influencers go? Today, I'm going to unpack exactly how and why the resistance failed, what factors ultimately led to its downfall, and why the death of this specific anti-Trump movement is ultimately a good thing for those of us who care about fighting right-wing extremism. To start, I want to take you back to 2017 internet. Mason Ramsey became famous overnight for yodeling in a Walmart. Fidget spinners were all the rage. Jake Paul released his iconic song, It's Everyday Bro, and everyone was using that Snapchat dancing hot dog filter. Algorithmic feeds were nascent, and mainstream social media platforms were largely seen as liberal spaces. Social media movements were regularly gaining traction on Twitter, and Instagram infographic activism was rampant. It was in this internet soup that resistance influencers first emerged. Leveraging Twitter primarily, previously unknown figures posted their way into overnight fame. A popular meme at the time was retweeting someone vaguely or unintentionally anti-Trump with, quote, "Welcome to the resistance." In January 2017, just days after Trump's inauguration, a bunch of Twitter users who ostensibly worked for the federal government set up anonymous Twitter accounts and grew huge followings from allegedly resisting Trumpism from the inside. These rogue resistance accounts included Rogue NOAA for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Rogue NASA for the Space Agency, and Alt FDA for the Rogue Food and Drug Administration. Another account called Alt EPA with more than 150,000 followers claimed that it would be offering data that might be suppressed by the EPA under Trump. "He can take our official account, but he'll never take our freedom," the account posted. "We are unofficially resisting." The posts gained traction with hashtags like #resist and #resistTrump. Another account, simply known as Angry Staffer, claimed to be a resistance mole within the White House. It posted liberal bait like, quote, "Given what I'm seeing here, I'm left with one option to save this nation. I'm going to start leaking everything." Of course, the leaks never came and the account stopped tweeting by 2018. Lip syncing to Trump was also a big thing back then. Remember Sarah Cooper? She literally got famous and landed a Netflix special just by doing shoddy lip syncs of Trump and sharing them to Twitter because boomers loved them so much. But the real stars of the resistance internet were the homegrown influencers like Mueller, She Wrote, a once anonymous account that posted detailed commentary on special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the election. But she mostly fed a steady stream of Russiagate conspiracies. There were also figures like Brooklyn Dad Defiant, a centrist lib poster who fed anti-Trump conspiracies to his liberal followers throughout Trump's first term. Brooklyn Dad Defiant then used that fame to publish a series of anti-Trump children's books, like one called The Littlest President, which I need to read you guys the description for this book. Quote, "Spanky McDumbass was a horrible little man who was a draft dodger, a creepy dad, a businessman, and a bad TV celebrity who lied and cheated his way to the most powerful position in America. This is the story of his improbable rise and his ultimate bigly fall." I think it's really funny that he also published one called, quote, "The Bigliest Loser" about Trump losing to Kamala Harris, which he published right before the election and which currently has 2.7 stars on Amazon. The top review currently reads, quote, "If you don't mind reading a book that reads as though it was written by somebody who dropped out of school before 7th grade, I guess this is passable." Anyway, the entire online resistance media ecosystem was built on top of a social web that no longer exists. If you look at the engagement surrounding some of these same anti-Trump influencers on X today, you can see that many of their numbers have stagnated or even declined. While it was easy to amass millions of impressions by tweeting Kofifi jokes about the Cheeto-in-Chief back in 2018, these resistance figures now struggle to attract an audience outside a dwindling base of Gen Xers and boomers who haven't evolved with the culture. The tech ecosystem has also radically shifted since Trump's first term. Twitter, once a bastion of liberalism, is now controlled by a right-wing billionaire who censors and bans left-wing voices. TikTok, which was banned by Biden, has since pivoted towards pro-Trump rhetoric and revamped its feed in hopes of reversing the ban. Instagram, too, has shifted to the right, with Zuckerberg encouraging misogynistic and anti-LGBTQ hate speech and cracking down on accounts that post progressive speech like advocating for a free Palestine. Many resistance influencers have also completely lost credibility. After spending years pushing liberal conspiracies like Russiagate, which claims that Putin hacked our election to install Trump in office, or absurd theories about investigations into Trump, all of which they claimed would ultimately lead to his downfall, but none of which came to fruition, people are just feeling less willing to listen. Many centrist Biden and Kamala supporting liberals have also adopted the exact same strain of conspiracism that they once criticized Trump supporters for espousing. I wrote an article last year about the rise of BlueAnon and how the communal warping of reality is spreading far beyond the right. One recent Economist poll found that only 52% of Harris supporters said they believed Trump legitimately won the 2024 election. Sure, liberals aren't storming the Capitol, but it's a lot harder to criticize MAGA supporters for living in an alternate reality when you now believe the exact same thing about your own preferred candidate. Researchers who study extremism have said that this strand of centrist liberal conspiratorial thinking arises when people are unable or unwilling to accept developments that challenge their worldview. It's also exacerbated by shifts in media. The entire internet has evolved over recent years, and older generations like boomers and Gen Xers are struggling to navigate this complex, fast-moving media climate. And while a certain subset of anti-Trump resistance influencers are still online crowing about Trump like it's 2018, many have realized that promoting that sort of liberalism under the current cultural climate is simply not as profitable as it once was. Trump won the popular vote, their conspiracies aren't panning out, so they might as well hop on board with the winning team. You see this in figures like Lindy Li, a quintessential resistance influencer. Lindy Li is a millennial political commentator who amassed hundreds of thousands of followers by being a shill for the Democratic Party in the late 2010s. She grew an intense and loyal fandom of resistance liberals throughout Trump's first term by posting a nonstop stream of anti-Trump news. When Biden was elected, she was relentless in her support of him. She backed Biden until the moment that he was forced to drop out and then became an ardent supporter of Kamala Harris. Li's social media feed was overrun with adoring posts featuring herself at events with the vice president, other top Democratic elected officials like Nancy Pelosi, and even Biden himself. Quote, "There will never be another like her," she said of Pelosi. She was also part of the Pennsylvania delegation at this most recent Democratic National Convention. Li called Trump a serial rapist on national television and lambasted the Republican Party. She attended all of the White House influencer events and panels under Biden and worked in lockstep with the administration to destroy any cohesive resistance efforts from the progressive left. But after Democrats lost this time around, Li pivoted. She started bashing Kamala's campaign and began to engage more actively with pro-Trump media. She lauded the momentum of Trump's transition, and by January 2025, Li was actively fundraising for Republican candidates and even Trump himself. Li now claims that she's been a conservative all her life, and that there will be a, quote, new era of prosperity under Trump. Li's evolution makes sense when you consider that many influencers who spent the years 2017 to 2020 pushing resistance content are now refashioning themselves as conservatives, as brands and big money interests seek to make inroads with the conservative movement. Then there's the fact that when you scratch the surface, many of the resistance's most ardent and prominent supporters during Trump's first term, especially white upper middle class Gen X women and boomers, weren't ever actually that liberal when it came down to it. The entirety of the resistance movement was a conservative movement that was intended to sell you hope for cash, said Carl Folk, a well-known extremism researcher. While many white people, especially white women, were happy to march in the streets when they thought Trump's policies relating to abortion or women's health care might directly affect them, they ultimately had no solidarity with poor people or the working class. Once they realized they weren't personally going to be affected by Trump's worst policies, they went right back to brunch. The liberals who made up the resistance from 2016 to 2020 seemed to primarily dislike Trump because of his crass, sexist language and disdain for political norms. But those same liberals ultimately didn't have problems with many of Trump's policies, as long as someone from their blue team was enacting them. They happily embraced Trump's far-right agenda surrounding immigration, COVID, and funding of Israel's genocide in Gaza, when Biden was carrying those things out. The entire resistance movement itself was mostly full of reactionary conservatives. was. You can see this very clearly when you dig into the pasts of some of the resistance most well-known influencers. Ron Filipowski, for instance, a video aggregator and one of the big resistance voices online, worked for Ron DeSantis until 2020. Mueller, she wrote, another big resistance influencer, was a failed stand-up comic and songwriter who used slurs on stage and wrote an album with extremely racist and sexist song titles before cashing in on anti-Trump content. Remember Brooklyn Dad Defiant? Well, before he pivoted his account to a resistance page, it was created in defiance of a court order for child support. He was pushing reactionary rhetoric that the court system is somehow biased against men for years. The resistance influencer Jack Hopkins is a rebranded pseudonym for a men's rights activist who was extremely deep into some of the most misogynistic and anti-women spaces on the internet in the 2000s. And the list goes on and on. The defining feature among some of the most well-known resistance influencers is that they are fundamentally conservatives. Just look at the Bulwark, the single biggest resistance media outlet still standing. It's published by Tim Miller, the former spokesperson for the Republican National Committee who served as communications director for Jeb Bush's 2016 campaign. Sarah Longwell, another co-founder of the Bulwark, is a former Republican lobbyist who says she believes that the best form of government is, quote, principled conservatism. The Bulwark's other big-name writer is Bill Kristol, a neoconservative commentator who founded the right-wing magazine The Weekly Standard and who worked for the Reagan and Bush administrations. Kristol played a leading role in the defeat of the Clinton healthcare plan and advocated for the Iraq War throughout the 2000s. Kristol is also a member of the board of trustees for the Manhattan Institute, the far-right think tank that quite literally birthed the entire movement to dismantle DEI. When these are the biggest voices in the movement to ostensibly resist fascism, it's easy to see why efforts have failed. Folk, the extremism researcher, told me, quote, I can walk through almost any of these resistance influencer accounts with receipts showing that they are in fact deeply conservative and in some cases even far right. These resistance figures came to understand that it was almost impossible to make money in an already saturated media ecosystem on the right, so they decided to pivot and take money from liberals. Now that the culture has swung away from liberalism and Trump won the popular vote, these conservative voices no longer need to pretend to provide a counter to conservatism. They can do what Biden ultimately did, provide a gradual and comforting off-ramp for liberals to accept Trump and embrace his regressive policies. The left wing of the party has been effectively hollowed out and threatened into submission, and many leftists have even come around to supporting Trump's reactionary policies. Major leftist organizations are completely unwilling to show even the most basic solidarity with disabled, poor, and vulnerable people by advocating for things like public health protections or worker safety. Some people in a delusional alternate reality might imagine that the mainstream media would keep these fundamentally reactionary influencers in check, but that arm of the resistance has been hollowed out too. Last summer, the Washington Post, where I used to work, fired their first ever female editor-in-chief and replaced senior staff with former Rupert Murdoch staffers. After Trump was elected again, they changed their resistance-era slogan from "Democracy dies in darkness" to "Riveting storytelling for all of America." Leaders at the company spoke out about needing to court a more conservative audience. CNN, once an anti-Trump stronghold, is making aggressive efforts to incorporate conservatives into their programming. A prominent example of this is the inclusion of Scott Jennings, a conservative commentator known for articulating the viewpoints of Red America. The New York Times has also taken steps to broaden its editorial scope by hiring more conservative voices. LA Times owner Patrick Soon-Shiong is considering launching a MAGA-friendly digital news outlet featuring Candace Owens called LA Times Next. While the mainstream media spent Trump's first term pearl-clutching over norms, they've all now basically accepted that they should treat him like any other president, and readers and viewers should too. On top of the mainstream media and tech world's rightward shifts, conservatives have also built a massive right-wing media infrastructure of social platforms catered specifically to pushing pro-Trump and reactionary messages. Rumble, Truth Social, and myriad other right-wing social media apps pump out conservative messaging and erode support for liberalism across the internet. But while all of these changes have undeniably contributed to snuffing out the resistance movement, over the past 4 years, no group has played a bigger role in dismantling the resistance to right-wing extremism than the Democratic Party. The dismantling of the resistance movement could not have happened without the full-throated support of the Democratic establishment. Cracks in the resistance coalition began to show as early as the 2020 primaries, when Democratic leaders rallied around Biden in order to crowd out the more progressive candidate, Bernie Sanders. A lot of people on the left felt betrayed, but many held out hope that Biden might enact some of the more progressive changes that they wanted to see. Unfortunately, after gaining office, the Biden administration worked overtime to alienate core progressive constituencies. Biden immediately responded to the Black Lives Matter movement by showering the police with even more funding. This resulted in the police murdering even more innocent civilians. 2023, Biden's second to last year in office, was the deadliest year on record ever for civilians killed by the police. Over 1,230 people were killed by law enforcement alone that year, according to the nonprofit Mapping Police Violence. Black Americans were disproportionately affected too, being nearly 3 times more likely to be killed by police. Biden also completely reneged on his promises to expand public health measures and protect vulnerable and disabled people and the broader public from mass deaths and disability from COVID. Instead of instituting long-term public health protections, he dismantled our public health infrastructure, mandated forced infections by lifting all airborne disease mitigation, forced people back to work, and enacted policies on COVID that were further to the right of Trump in 2020. And he did all of this while prematurely declaring the pandemic over because companies like Delta Airlines asked him to. And just to be clear, the pandemic is still raging according to the World Health Organization, which has never once declared it over. Biden also failed to fulfill promises that he made to young people related to climate change and student debt. When massive Gen Z influencers who helped Biden get elected attempted to hold the administration accountable, Biden responded by blacklisting those very influencers from the White House. His administration cracked down hard on protesters and worked to dismantle Americans' free speech and civil liberties through pushing laws like the TikTok ban and pursuing criminal charges against student protesters fighting against his administration's support of the genocide in Gaza. Folk summarized the actions of the Democratic Party this way, quote, "Over the past few years, we've seen waves of some of the biggest protests and sustained actions in this country since the 1960s, which include the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests against our funding of the genocide in Gaza. The reaction from Democrats to both these things has been radically different than from when liberals were protesting Trump's policies in 2017 and 2018. Centrist liberals in Biden's coalition spent the past 4 years banding together to squash progressive movements, which ultimately led average people to feel disenchanted and hopeless. Quote, "What the Biden administration did is show working people that those in power can just ignore these big, massive protests and not pay any political price for it," Folk said. The resistance died a death by 1,000 cuts. Talia Jane, the journalist, recently echoed this analysis on X, noting that, quote, "The reason protests aren't having the impact that they used to have is that those with power simply stopped caring about the social shame or impact of their actions. Most members of the public now feel like no matter what they do, their voices will simply be ignored by people in power. We've witnessed things like RICO charges being levied at protesters fighting against Cop City in Atlanta, mask bans that lock disabled people out of public life, and young students at universities across America facing federal charges for peaceful protests. Again, all under Democratic leadership. Taking to the streets now seems risky in a way that it didn't just 5 years ago and ultimately feels pointless. The death of the resistance movement does offer one critical lesson, that superficial opposition led by establishment figures and former Republican operatives was never poised to effect genuine liberation from right-wing extremism. The performative dissent of the resistance always lacked the structural depth and the grassroots foundation necessary for substantive change. The fact that the resistance relied so heavily on individuals that were deeply entrenched in the existing political framework meant that it was always doomed to fail. Figures like Liz Cheney, despite their vocal opposition to certain Trump policies, will always fundamentally uphold conservative agendas that conflict with progressive ideals. Making these types of people, along with a slew of social media opportunists, the face of a political movement against right-wing extremism was always absurd. Because when you dig right down to it, their foundational beliefs ultimately align with the very candidate that they're purporting to resist. The commodification of dissent within the resistance movement also undermined its credibility. These resistance influencers commercialized their activism, transforming resistance into a lucrative enterprise devoid of genuine commitment to change. To effectively counter right-wing extremism, we need to cultivate a broad-based movement rooted in class solidarity. This type of approach goes beyond traditional partisan divides and focuses on the shared economic struggles that unite the working class in America. This requires admitting that people are struggling to make ends meet, that they're being exploited by their jobs, and millions cannot get access to healthcare. These are all issues that members of the Democratic establishment and resistance influencers shamed progressives for bringing up throughout Biden's presidency and Kamala's campaign. I do think that as Trump inevitably fails to deliver on his promises, there is room for some sort of political alternative to emerge. But it should not be one that comes from the establishment. Just look at the recent reaction to Luigi Mangione. There is a collective frustration and anger that Americans are feeling that transcends political affiliations. And right now, the far right are the only ones that are even acknowledging that anger. It's an anger that the resistance influencers completely fail to ever address. Real change will require grassroots organizing, community engagement, and rooting out establishment figures whose goals are not aligned with working people. I think that at the end of the day, the disintegration of the resistance ecosystem is a good thing. Resistance shouldn't be a media brand or a personality cult. Reactionary politics can't be countered by smug tweets, hashtags, cable news talking points, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg merch. Ultimately, the death of the resistance presents an opportunity to reconstruct opposition to right-wing extremism on a more solid foundation. It gives the next generation of the resistance the opportunity to fight for actual systemic change. This evolution is crucial if we ever want to build a system that serves everyone's needs, not just the needs of the rich establishment. I'm Taylor Lorenz. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to my tech and online culture newsletter, usermag.co. That's usermag.co. I cover all of these issues and more. See you next time.